Okay, so let's take a look at a little sort of Dasein daily podcast, as it were, because we're going to look at current events in the light of this everything we know from the 2,600 years of political, philosophic tradition and beyond. So we have this statement. So Fukuyama has come out in a rash, declaring victory because his recommendation has been taken up on the point of ought there to be a sort of Dasein Andersetzung by the Europeans with Trump, which is to say standing up to Trump rather than placating Trump. And then we had some Mette Frederiksen had made this announcement that by no means is it possible to have a tete-a-tete with somebody who's lacks this so-called treasuring of the sovereignty, of the principle of sovereignty, and therefore the discussion on Greenland is not only moot, but it's not to say poisonous, absolutely poisonous. Anybody who would go in that direction has already done what the Val Chamberlain is in the Dasein version said to do, although I've heard that some good sources came out and said that's not really the case if you looked at what was really going on, and somebody wrote a book about it. But that's the common view, just as the common view was among the educated public for the longest time was that Jeffrey Sachs was the shock therapy guy, and that it wasn't what actually happened, which is that he gave good counsel to the Polish economists, and then they, being of some skill, decided to take him up on his recommendations and actually carried them out in a way that was efficacious. But that when Sachs said, well, no, why don't we also do this in Russia, people in suits, as Putin calls them, came in and said, no, this is not going to happen. And the implication being is that this is the Cold War enemy. We've won, and now they paid the price. So there's these different versions hanging around in the offing of what exactly happened at that Fukuyama end of history. But let's say Fukuyama's end of history means something that already comes after Hegel's end of history claim has long since gone away. And what Strauss is saying is Fukuyama's end of history is an ideology, whereas Hegel's was a claim at a rational teaching. Ideology is irrational speech, which is treasured by Schatz, treasured by some. Nietzsche's always talking about esteeming, according to the usual translation. It could be said respecting. It could be said treasuring. There's some statement made. It's irrational, but it's treasured by the people who it gives direct benefit to in their actual lives as their lives are. So I mean, to take, for example, the example that Strauss was giving of the Christian Science reading room. The Christian Science teaching may have been coming under sort of attack by those well-spoken New York Jews who were attending the Christian Science reading room meetings in the 40s, in the mid-40s. And maybe they could have, so taken from the point of view of the rational teaching, maybe they could have made some improvements to the teaching offered by the Christian Scientists and the but of course the people there in the reading room who had to defend the Christian Science teaching weren't the uppermost first tier theologians of Christian Science. They weren't the best, absolute best representatives, and therefore it would have been somewhat embarrassing to them if they had to defend the teaching they actually subscribed to persons who were better versed in it than they were. But there you could see a situation. There's the people that actually run the bookstore, and then there's people saying, no, but you could be a little more rational here. You could improve, and actually making such a strong case that they're sort of, no, we would rather prefer something irrational, and that is, yeah, please leave. We're asking you to stop attending our meetings. It's enough. Thank you, that's very nice, but it's enough. They preferred the irrational ideology of the law of properties, the law of private property, the law of private property. We could exclude you. This is private property. We can exclude you. They preferred this irrational mechanism to what could be more rational, the teaching that was being brought in. I mean, this is all just hypothetical, or I don't know. If it's true, I guess it's a counterfactual if it's about the past. Forensic speech, maybe. Our future hopes, maybe. I don't know. It could go in different directions depending on how you want to think about it. The general meaning then of ideology, as Strauss sees it, is this on the one side, the Paul is sort of involved in whatever it's doing, and then on the other side, this force is claiming to give the speeches which are rational and therefore which should be treasured beyond any treasure. So that's one of the problems with the ideology as it comes in with Fukuyama, is that what he's calling end of history is really to say, here's this thing that's highly esteemed by some people, but basically for the motives of the Maslow pyramid or for something like that, which we can't take to, nobody can take to be somehow that we have to simply swallow that like it's a medicine, and now we're becoming more realist. Now we're seeing the truth of things. I would say no, because clearly that would mean, well, one, it would imply that you could neatly show us what the limits are, and when we start to veer into metaphysics, when we start to go wrong, or if this teaching isn't a metaphysics, when we start to veer into metaphysics, maybe it's claimed, maybe this teaching too is a kind of metaphysics, but then, yeah, there's all kinds of problems, right? So you have something that looks like an ideology, the Fukuyama version of this thing that I'm defining as liberal democracy consistently, and has these characteristics, including election, including a certain form of market where the government doesn't own that much of the key industries and key supply parts of the supply chain, where they with privatization, some kind of privatization where you get an exact Fukuyama formula for what the state should be doing and how much the private sector should be doing things, and what the standards are for when it fails and so on. And yeah, this is his ideology of the end of history. I think when this particular model takes over, no matter how irrational it is, no matter how evil it is, that will be de facto the end of history. So the difference is, when we're looking at Hegel, what Hegel is claiming is, here's something that all countries on earth of their own, when they see it, they'll all want it, they'll all treasure it. And it just it happens to come from a certain part of the world, and Hegel happens to be there, but it's not just as with the material sciences. It's Hegel's saying it's just something that's true for everyone. So one could certainly see that with certain kinds of material proficiencies, right? That it seems to be just true for everyone. Although, if you're an old believer, then you refuse coffee, then you may refuse a lot of different kinds of machines. Maybe Dugan does as well. So that's maybe I have a liberal bias on that, seeing it that way. Could we see it? I mean, was Hegel's claim true? Was Hegel's claim true? What did he actually discover? Some parts of reason that every country on earth will accept as and treasure somehow, and or esteem, or as it were in Nietzsche, in that translated sense, attributed to Nietzsche, translated interpretation. Yeah. This is yeah, I mean, this is like thinking in the sort of direct sense of nature as showing justice in terms of, like, if you get hurt or something, then put a Band-Aid on it or something. And if it, like, the physical system works that way, then that's justice somehow. Then it's things have done justice. It ought to, if you do this and this, it ought to stop the bleeding. That's justice. It becomes this sense of it becomes a specific selection of the sense of what justice is. Yeah, there's the question of whether Hegel, as over and against all the other cultures, like in that book, the Cannibal Metaphysics, has presented something, a dimension, a transcendental dimension, which ought to reach all the Dasein, which deserve to reach the angst of all the Dasein. So Heidegger says. So I think what Heidegger directs toward, he says you can't. There's no position where one can know where the eternity is. And so instead he says, the Dasein, has angst, and it has death. It knows about its death, or thinks itself to know about its death. So in this angst, which doesn't point to any particular threat or other, or any empirical concern, but rather with the Sein rather than Seiendes, Sein rather than Seiendes. Then you get a position where Dasein thought very close to angst, by reminding itself that it will die. It sort of this remembers at the same time the angst situation, where angst is kind of pointing towards Heidegger's version, Sein, or the Heidegger's version of the ontological difference. Dasein, angst, or Sorge, concern, as right at the thought of the being as against beings. But the thought of being as against beings, it's not thought as the hen in Top Haunter, the version of the one and the all. It's not thought in the with the already specific logos giving it its exact sense, and saying this is how you have to think it. But nonetheless, I think it's still here. We could ask, is Heidegger presenting an ideology or an irrational speech? And how do we know exactly? So this idea that now we have a European grouping, and they've followed Fukuyama and taken this tack toward opposing Trump. But on the other hand, they're saying, well, Trump the thing about Greenland was it got the markets kind of fussed, and then for certain tactical reasons, Trump just isn't going to stress the Greenland issue right now or something. It's not exactly clear what's happening. Has the Europeans coming together behind Mette Frederiksen's grand remark played a big role here. So, but now here's the thing: like and Zizek's pointed this out too, is the beginning point of the comment on making the big deal about sovereign territory. Okay, we know there's been abuses of that by in Libya and in Syria, Operation Timber Sycamore, and actually in many other places, many other covert regime changes. The idea of sovereignty has been selectively respected, especially since Kosovo and so on, especially since the Clinton era, I would say. But why is it, if you just go by the question, is if the law is rational, if the law is rational, then it's a true law, then it's law. Why is it actually irrational that it's being, I mean, there's been abuses, okay, but why would it be those we can call abuses, and then we could say, we could always point out when there's abuses, even if it's, I mean, it would get fetishistic if it was just pointless to point, if it just became a joke to point out the abuses. But as long as it kind of functions to some extent, then we could still say, why isn't this a good rule? Like, why isn't it a good rule to say there should be no breach of sovereign territory? So, and then there's this elaborate theory about, that there's region outside the control of the nations, and there's no grand hegemon or philosopher king up above them, creating one world federation. There's no one world federation that is in the Musk and Star Trek version. Although Musk tries to do it on Mars, maybe, like start a whole world that's all under one federative power. I think it's certain. I guess it would be. I mean, unless, I think it certainly would be. It's almost like Australia, right? According to Zizek, this is something of a pattern of some right-wing guys of this ground zero version of trying to start the human being over from nothing. It's the sort of interesting form of accelerationism, maybe. So you have in that direction the question of sovereignty just straightforwardly, and is it a rational rule? But then the answer, I think, would be that if you could know what the start position, that was the right start position was. Like at the origin of the notion of legitimacy and this type of political usage was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when some deposed monarchs came forward and said we were unrightfully deposed, since after all Napoleon was not the actual emperor, he was actually a Corsican, and so although of some unimportant extraction, and we should be. It's illegitimate that we've been displaced. Put us back on the throne, and so on. And then there's this notion of legitimate change of territory and change of potentate comes in. Okay. But then ever after that, there's simply what happened. And then at some moment when somebody thought it was in their, or they thought according to themselves that it looked just at this moment, but probably they would, had very blanched vision, I guess. Had very, they had, I don't know, they had the vision that they had, very bleached vision, let's say, not unable to sort of bring these problems into life, using very bleached language, which seemed to be indicate common sense and the powers of stability and normalcy. So what I mean, how are these people that are talking in the most textbook way? Are they then able to say this is the right moment to start the rule of sovereignty? Because all the lines on the maps are drawn in the right ways. So I mean, for instance, it seems like if, in order to support this kind of old Malia Russia and Muscovy thing, it requires a certain amount of territory, including the territory called the Ukraine, for it to be whole. Then it's like that's an argument for that being the true beginning of the sovereignty of that entity. But if you just go to a certain moment in 91 or something, and in fact they had done a referendum at the beginning of the year when most Ukrainians wanted to stay with the Russian Federation. Then there were political machinations, and Yeltsin showed the Duma, violence in Moscow, insanity. And so then they forced another election, and the Ukrainians then at that time, who had 70% voted to stay with Russia, suddenly vote out, and then the West declares, "Oh, this is the true vote. This is the true voice of Ukraine." And then you had 30 years of education or indoctrination, and then in Hilly Lacrimae, you have a different population than you did at the time of that original referendum. But which is the truth? So, but when do you declare the sovereignty and unviolable legitimacy issue should be treasured ultimately and can't be broken? It was arbitrary when they said the beginning of it was. So that's the problem with the principle. The principle is sort of has a mathematical beauty to it, if you like, but the moment when you apply it in history makes a huge difference.